Great. So welcome everyone to the Peer Support and the Pandemic. Did it thrive or just survive? I am delighted to see so many of you joining us, and I look forward to what experiences and thoughts each of our brilliant panelists are going to share today. If you haven't met me before, my name's Callum and I'm a partner with Habitus. Habitus is an international collective of community, health, social sector leaders. We design services, we research lots of different issues, and we're the hosts of today's event. We've actually got offices in Canada and in the UK. So some of those people with Habitus in front of their name, some of them are in Canada and some of them are in the UK too. Personally, I am calling you today from London in the UK. So all of our experience in Habitus leads to what we want is better health comes for others through the strategy work that we do, through the programs that we try and set up. And what's really important is that we want people to be able to evaluate their impact and programs to actually be working. So that's why a session like today for us is so important, because we get to share knowledge, best practice when things have been working really well and potentially when things haven't been working so well as well. So before I get into the agenda itself, I wanted to share just some ground rules and expectations for today. And they are as follows. So not only do we have different accents because we're from different places, we're also from different cultures, which means respectfulness and openness for understanding is really key. We will be moderating the chat, and I have to say we might remove anyone if there's any trolling or behavior that's in any way discriminatory. So I think the ground rules being that we're just going to be very respectful of one another, and we're open and curious to learn about each other's cultures, and especially how we use peer support as part of our service delivery in our various areas and communities. I do want to let you know if the session's a bit too much for you today, or there's just too much for you going on, we are recording it and we can share it back with you later on if needs be. So what's the session actually about? Well, as everyone is very aware, the impact of the pandemic has had a major impact on people's health. And you'll have learned that whether in the news, social media, hearing service user stories, or just your own firsthand experiences of peer support in the pandemic. We are all a group of really passionate people about peer support, and we all deeply believe that it's one of the keys to reducing the isolation that is driving some of the worsening of the mental health for so many at the moment. I think we do believe that peer supporters have the experience, the training, and the ability to connect with others, increasing the resilience and resourcefulness for those that they connect with to deal with that anxiety and the uncertainty that's being created by the past 21 months. That uncertainty has really had deep impacts on our mental health, but we all see peer support as a key. And so today is really about how do we create and open a space and influence so that peer support can really be utilized to its full extent. Yeah, so what does the agenda look like? Well, in a moment, I'm going to get our guests to introduce themselves, who they are, where they're from, and what's brought them here today, and their understandings and expertise in peer support. And then I've got a couple of pre-prepared questions that I'm going to share with our guests. And then I'm going to open up the floor to all of you to pop your questions in the chat. We do have a couple of questions as well that we asked people beforehand, and we might use some of them too. I'll then close the session at the top of the hour with a question about the future. And then after that, we are trying to kind of use this Zoom a bit like being in an in-person conference. So you'll be able to join any breakout room that you like. Those breakout rooms will be open for 10 minutes. And in each breakout room, we'll have a guest speaker and myself. So if you've got any questions for me, for Allison, or Louise, or Amanda, all you have to do is join that room. There'll also be a Habitus host there. So if you have any technical questions or anything like that that they can answer, they'll be there for you too. Then I'll call everyone back from those sessions and we will close out the day, definitely on time. So without further ado, you probably heard me talk far, far too much. So I would love to introduce our first speaker. So I think I will start in England. So Amanda, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself to our audience.
Thank you. Hello. Delighted to be here. I wouldn't call myself a peer support expert. I learn every single day. It's just the most extraordinary job, and I'm very passionate about it. So where am I? I'm in Norfolk and Suffolk, NHS Foundation Trust. So I've currently got a storm off the sea raging behind me. So fingers crossed, my connection carries on. I started a long time ago, when they first introduced kind of the recovery model into our trust, and I volunteered to help set up the recovery college, which I subsequently kind of worked as a peer tutor in, then got employed as a peer support worker, where I worked in an adult community mental health team, and I'm now peer support lead for the trust, leading. At the moment, we've got 72 employed peer support workers, and I've got currently active recruitment for over 50. So it gives you an idea as to how recruitment has ramped up during the pandemic, and workforce transformation as they're kind of looking at peer support as an option. So delighted to be here. Should just say my other hat, I'm also a lived experience researcher. I'm currently doing a Ph.D. at King's College London on safety planning and recovery oriented approach to risk management, which is my kind of other passion. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Amanda. I believe it's Treaty 13 and Toronto. Allison, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Yeah, happy to be here. So I am the National Manager of Peer Support Canada. I just came on in August into this role, but have been working with Peer Support Canada for quite some time before that, and also have been working in community mental health, specifically in peer support, for the duration of my career. So I've had the pleasure of working in various environments with peer support. So we've worked sort of the full spectrum from grassroots community peer support groups all the way. I've done sort of peer support in educational settings, so on campuses and universities and high schools, and then also in the hospital system. So I've been able to support peer support workers that are working within inpatient, addiction, emergency department settings. And yeah, and then my role now with Peer Support Canada, I'm leading us through a strategic planning process as we work to figure out sort of what are the needs of peer support workers across Canada, and how can we support the peer support workforce who are struggling with certain things, and how can we support peer support organizations that are looking for increased capacity and things like that across Canada. So happy to be here, and also always learning.
Here's Allison, and we'll finish up in Scotland with Louise.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Louise Christie. I'm the Director of Scottish Recovery Network. We're a small national organisation that promote and support recovery and mental health in Scotland and sometimes further afield. We've been going since 2004, and peer support has always been an important part of our work programme, and particularly promoting the idea of peer support roles in the mental health system, and encouraging and supporting a lot of the great peer support groups and activities that there are in Scotland. For us, that's become crystallised over the last few years, and our current strategy, one of our two main programmes, is focused on supporting the development of peer support approaches and roles across the mental health system. We're in a different position from England in that we have quite a lot of peer workers, and it is growing, but mostly in the third sector. Many of them are not paid posts, but there is a growing number of paid posts. And our work has been focused around helping organisations develop these approaches, providing spaces for peer workers and volunteers to come together, share learning. We also have a series of resources, particularly focused around our free to access peer-to-peer training. And for us, this has been very much a learning process, and a process of figuring out where the opportunities are in Scotland and how we can help make that happen. So I'm really look forward to the discussion this afternoon. And if anybody's interested in us, we're easily found at www.scottishrecovery.net. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Louise. Just hold tight, because I think I'll put the first question out to you. But just a heads up, any of you that are in the UK right now, Amanda, the storm has just hit London. So if my internet signal goes down, I think anyone in the UK may have to caveat that today. Anyway, this is going to be a fireside chat. It's informal, and I'm really excited for the panelists to kind of connect with one another. Feel free as well to share your comments in the chat too. So the first question, like I said, Louise, I'll start with you. So peer support, in my opinion, was perfectly placed to support much of the mental health impact from the pandemic. Do you feel like it's been utilised to its full potential? And if you don't think that, why not?
I think there's two sides to that question for me. So in Scotland, the pandemic hit, we went into lockdown, and a lot of the discussion in mental health was about the disappearance of formal mental health services. But while we saw that in Scottish Recovery Network, we also noticed that a lot of the third sector were reorganising, they were reorientating, they were figuring out how to stay in contact with people, but also like volunteer-run peer support groups were discovering Zoom, taking a deep breath and realising that you could spend a year on risk assessment, or you can actually reach out and provide spaces and places online where people can support each other. So I think that peer support itself actually made the best of the pandemic. I think that many in the third sector found peer support a valuable opportunity, even if it was over the phone. So we had an example of a number of peer workers in Dundee getting together, and they had a peer support helpline, which many people found very helpful. I think the other side of the question for me is now we're hopefully coming out of the pandemic, although I'm an ever hopeful person. We've been coming out of the pandemic since about 2 days after it started with me. But I think I am a bit concerned in Scotland that while there is some recognition that we need to learn the lessons of what really worked for people, including peer support and the opportunities that digital peer support provided, we are falling back in Scotland into business as usual and medicalised statutory services, and not necessarily properly investing in what's happening in other places, which was valuable to people and was much more relational based. And I think part of our role is to keep that pressure up. There is some indications that the pandemic has provided a space for rethinking, particularly in primary care. So we're very hopeful that in Scotland we will actually see some strategic buy-in to the idea that peer support is not a fluffy befriending extra, but is actually an essential component of the mental health system. And part of our work with peer support groups and peer workers and organisations that are interested in this is to get that groundswell for change and to make it happen. So I think there is two sides to the story, and I don't think it's all negative. I think the way that peer support groups, particularly many of them volunteer run, responded to the pandemic has to be applauded, celebrated and learnt from.
So I see strong nodding from Amanda and Allison. I'm happy for the two of you to fight it out. Who would like to comment next?
I'm happy to. You're right, Allison. Okay. I would agree. I mean, I think that there's been both pros and cons. There's been both really good things and some struggles. I think for our peer support workers, especially, one of the things that they spend a lot of time doing, because we're a secondary mental health service, so we're a secondary service, is actually supporting people to do the social activities within the community. And of course that all shut down very, very quickly. And they were kind of left going, well, now what are we supposed to do, right? So there was that initial kind of, okay, now we can't do what we have been doing. But of course that opened up thinking, as it often does. And maybe there are other things that we could do, and how can we work in more flexible ways with people. And actually out of that, of course, you see some extraordinary things happening, and you see peer support groups running online, and they're sitting knitting and talking recovery, or they're knitting chime, or whatever they're doing, which is quite extraordinary. So I think that the good bit for me has been the flexibility, the ability to actually not always say, well, we always go and visit people in their homes, or we always take people out into the community. But actually, for some people, that doesn't work. And actually, for some people, working from home works for them individually as peer support workers. And actually, for our service users, that's a preference. And I'm certainly not getting told by my organisation that it will ever go back to how it was. There is a kind of acknowledgement that I think that the way we deliver services has changed forever. So I think that that's extraordinarily useful and something to be celebrated.
Yeah, I think I'm nodding along because I think that there's a lot of synchronicity going on in Canada too. Canada is also massive, and peer support exists everywhere in the country, but to varying degrees in different contexts. It looks different across the country. So I think to be honest, when I'm thinking about this question, I think it depends on where you look, which is sort of what Louise and Amanda have said as well. But in the context and in the environments where there was flexibility and there was funders that were able to adapt and say, spend the money how you need to spend the money, peer support was able to come through in those contexts, and peer support workers were able to sort of step up and fill that gap. I will say that I think that when the pandemic hit and everybody sort of felt like the world was ending, the people's capacity to engage in clinical DBT skills or these sort of clinical skills-based learning was not there, because the world is ending. How can I learn these skills? How can I focus on these clinical interventions when really I just need to talk about what's going on right now? And I think that peer support was really good for that, because it is so non-prescriptive, and the peer support workers were really able to meet the people where they're at, which is in the middle of a pandemic. So I think that there was a lot of opportunity, and as I said, in the environments where that flexibility was there, we could see peer support stepping up into that role. But I think the barriers that existed pre-pandemic continue to exist. I hate to be sort of the downer maybe, but I think that some of the barriers, of credentialism and stigma of, oh, how can we possibly let peer support workers, see participant records or things like that. I think some of those barriers continue to exist. And a lot of the role confusion is a barrier as well, because I think there's a lot of sort of confusion about what the role of a peer support worker is and what it's not. And I think that has prevented peer support from being able to do everything that it can do across the country. But yeah, I think it does vary a lot, but that's sort of what I've seen.
What do you reckon, Amanda?
Sorry, can I say one more thing too?
Yeah, of course.
Is the I just also want to give some credit to the informal peer support that I saw throughout the pandemic, right? I mean, I know we saw that globally, where people helping people, and the sheer increase in the use of Zoom shows that people wanted to connect, right, and wanted to support each other, and got pretty creative and inventive about what that looks like. So as Louise said, I think we need to learn from that as well, Yeah, anyways.
No, I was just going to say, I kind of saw Amanda nodding there a wee bit around. I would love your insight on that, if that confusion still exists, or if the pandemic helped with the confusion in England around the roles of a peer supporter versus an OT or a caseworker or a transition worker. Would you say that it's improved, or it hasn't really changed very much? Or
No, I think we still continue to have those conversations daily with teams. I think what's helped is that I'm more visual in my trust, because I'm working virtually, so people can get hold of me. So people, instead of kind of thinking they've got to muddle through and kind of find these answers, I am much more visual, so people are able to kind of come to me and go, can peer support workers do XYZ? No. bed management is not what they do, and able to kind of have there's definite role confusion. And I think that in some ways that has been ramped up a little bit by the pandemic, because actually we have chronic workforce shortages. We've got staff off sick. We've got lowest, I think, numbers of staff that we've ever seen. I actually have never seen my trust in quite this state in terms of staff. And so it's all hands on deck. So suddenly, where you might have protected the integrity of the role slightly more, I get a little bit more pressure. So, can they just do, well, yes, as a one-off, but not as a regular, part of their job. But I think that people, what I am seeing is that people are at least understanding that there is a difference before they co-opt, which is probably better than just co-opting and reinventing what peer support is, if that makes sense.
I think that's terrific insight personally. I'm going to pick on you again, Allison, then I'll jump back to Louise, but I think we were talking about how we're always learning. So was there a moment in the pandemic that really challenged your perceptions or what peer support is, or you learned something new as a result of the pandemic with peer support that you could put your finger on?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I don't know if it's a new learning, but something that was really highlighted for me was the value of that flexibility and adaptability that peer support has, right? The fact that we, as peer support workers are not, put in a box of you must only do this and only this is what you do and only this, I think was such an asset during this time of complete unpredictability and a need for everybody to adapt. Peer support workers were able to sort of say, okay, normally I would go out into the community and bring this person to this appointment or to the store or whatever it is, and I can't do that now, but I can do this instead, right? And I think the adaptability of the peer support workers was so impressive to me during this pandemic. We were all humans, all going through the woes of upheaval and job loss and insecurity and no toilet paper and things like that. And so the fact that our peer support workers were able to go with the flow to the extent they were was so impressive to me, and really reminded me that we need to take care of these people, right? I think that was something that got a little bit misconstrued or lost in the pandemic was our peer support workers can jump up and fill these gaps and they can do anything, and I'm a big believer in peer support, obviously, but you need to support them, you need to provide resources, you need to make sure that you're not sort of putting the weight of the world on them and not adding resources to support them with that. So I think that was something that I sort of was highlighted for me during the pandemic is their tremendous ability to adapt and go with the flow and really meet people where they're at, but also the need to support and to resource peer support workers, right? It's not a cheap form of labor, and it's not a replacement of another role. It's a complement to, it's an addition to, it's an essential piece of the puzzle, and one that needs resourcing in order for it to work. Yeah.
That's great. Same question for you, Louise. Anything that's really challenged or just something new rather than a challenge for you over the pandemic in learning?
I think something that came out for me was that we would talk about peer volunteers and the different roles in peer support workers, but the group that really, I think we realised we had, I wouldn't like to say underappreciated, but maybe not really thought about particularly, are peer group facilitators. It became very important, and we did some research on digital peer support, reaching out to people to find out. And it did crystallise some of our thinking that actually peer group facilitation skills and that role of peer group facilitator, being a peer, not making sure the group's peer-led, is really important, but also how to do that in a digital space. And what was wonderful is we did the research, but we also ran a couple of events which brought lots and lots of peer group facilitators and others together to talk about the different ways that they manage practice, the different ways that they get support. So I think for us is realising that in Scotland, I think for us now, that group of people, the peer group facilitators, whether they're paid or unpaid, are a group that we see as very important and as part of the future landscape, and that probably need something more specialist than the generic peer support worker training So that came out for us, and I think it was particularly in the digital space it all became very clear, because people were finishing maybe facilitating a group, and then they were in their house, they didn't even have that cheerio cup of tea to tidy up the biscuits with someone. So I think it just really brought home to us that we need to start thinking, rather than peer workers as this homogenous group, that within it there's a lot in common, but there's groups of people who are doing things that are incredibly important and that we want to continue. My colleague has put reference to the research report, which is, I have to say, a great read, because it's nice and short and easy to read and clear. And also coming from that, my colleague Leslie, who's a great peer support advocate, coming from these events, we developed a sort of a thing called Empowering Connections, which was some top tips for digital peer support groups. So I think there was something for me about going, well, actually, let's split this up and look at particular needs of particular groups, and realising that there is, lots of different needs within what could be seen as a homogenous group.
Oh, thanks for that. So I'm just going to invite, if you have any questions for any of the panelists, it can be to a specific person, any questions, feel free to start popping them in the chat now. While that comes in, I've got one last question, and I'm going to put it out to any panelist. Would be, I think we have a tendency, I feel like, in this sector to speak quite contextually sometimes, or about concepts. And I think sometimes those stories are really helpful. Amanda, kind of the story you just shared, that really kind of, it struck a chord with me. It totally made sense. So is there a specific story that stands out for you over the pandemic, where it really demonstrates kind of peer support working to its full potential?
Yes, I was thinking about this. Such an interesting question. Thank you for it, because I was thinking about it, because there's I think I found I was very lucky, because I was going, oh, I've got quite a lot of stories I could share, which just made my day. And I was thinking that in the early days of the pandemic, when we all got kind of sent home and then actually dispersed, a lot of our peer support workers were asked to go and work in different teams or in different places than they normally do. And as an organisation, I think it's fair to say that we've got most of our peer support workers work within our community teams, and very few within our acute inpatient areas. And we've really struggled to embed them. And one peer support worker did end up going and spending some time and doing some shifts on one of the wards. And it was particularly, so it's been a challenging ward culturally for me to have conversations. And it's a ward that actually, they could have been having peer support. I've got money and resource to put peer support on, and they were the ones blocking it. They really didn't want it. And this peer support worker did a couple of shifts on there, and then I get an email from the ward manager going, how can we get our own peer support worker? Which, is just one of those, okay, maybe they don't need me to just talk about how great peer support is. They just need to see it modelled, right? Why didn't I think of that when I'm trying to persuade teams that they need peer support? So I think that that's just a great example that we could.
Yeah, seeing is believing. Yeah, that has been my experience over and over again. Allison, any story you could share?
Yeah, it's funny. I was going to say something else, but then Amanda's anecdote made me think of. I've had the pleasure of supporting a program out of Sinai Hospital in Toronto, and where they have young adult peer support workers working in the emergency department at Sinai. And the program, actually, we finally had done, it took 2 years to get a job posting up, because that's the bureaucracy of hospitals. And anyway, so we'd done all of the background work on getting this program up and ready to go. We finally finished their peer support training, so folks were ready to start working in the emergency department, and that was on like March 12th or something. And so the pandemic hit, and all of these questions of, oh, can we have this new role introduced into the hospital during a pandemic came up, and there was maybe like a week delay, and the hospital advocated that no, now more than, first of all, the hospital recognized that this is probably the new normal. So, if we don't do it now, then we're never going to do it. And second of all, the peer support workers who were supporting young adults were able to be, not only perform all the duties of their role as peer supporters, but most of these young people were coming in with no visitors because of the pandemic. And to be a 16-year-old who's struggling with their mental health and being admitted possibly for the first time without a family member, a friend, an ally, anything is atrocious to me, and just rampant with trauma. So so the fact that we were able to say, no, we're going ahead, like these peer support workers are essential members of the healthcare team, and if we believe that, then get them in there. And we were able to do that, I think was really badass, if I do say so myself, and a huge asset to the young people that were coming through the emergency department in the middle of the pandemic, dealing with X, Y, and Z. So yeah.
I don't know if you're allowed to do this as an MC, but I did want to kind of share my own type of story, and maybe I'll bring the tone down a little bit. And I think, but it's important to talk about some stories that we didn't see the impacts of peer support, the positive impacts happening. So through Habitus, we work with loads of different kind of organizations. And I think, I don't know how I answer my earlier question, which is my learning throughout this pandemic has really been the leadership that is required for peer support to happen or not. And that awareness of our leaders. So I can think of a particular organization where lots of potential, lots of resources ready to go. But with a disruption in leadership at the beginning, that did happen a lot in the pandemic. You know, quickly as leaders, we had to decide where are we going to put our resources to respond, and those small decisions, because I think like any leaders in an organization at the beginning of the pandemic, you were making 20, 30 decisions in an hour. And if you missed that decision with of how much you could utilize peer support at the beginning, it could, and for some organizations, it set a trajectory for a long time that was difficult to come back from. And it is absolutely possible, and you don't just get one go at peer support, but it's been really a big learning for me, is that though I always want to focus on the strengths of the individual peer support workers on the front line, the allies and the leaders that are responsible for the delivery of that peer support, like they cannot be missed, and we can't neglect them. And so to give them the skills, supports, and just the knowledge to make the best decision that they can is really important, because yeah, there's been a real spectrum of different outcomes. So I can see that we're starting to get questions, and I've gotten a private question, and I'm going to go to you first, Louise, with this one. And I think because you talk so well to kind of the digital kinds of sides of what Scottish Recovery Network has researched. So the question is if there's any digital innovations, specific digital innovations that you're aware of that really do focus on the strength of peer support and making peer connections.
I think there is. I think the fact that so many peer support groups found their way online, I am not in any way saying that was an easy journey or one without informed positive risks, or one that wasn't challenging for the group facilitators and some of the people attending. But what we do know is that peer support worked for a lot of people, not for everyone, but it also worked for a lot of people who didn't come along to face-to-face groups. And I think we've learned, certainly as an organisation, we've learned that we maybe don't reach some people we used to, but we certainly reach other people we don't. And, you know, there is pluses and minuses in that. But what we found in a lot of organisations was that people would say there is some people who are not keen in the digital groups, we'll keep in touch with them by phone, but a lot of people were able to. I think what's interesting about it, and when it comes to health systems, they start thinking about e-health. It starts to get incredibly technological. They think about developing systems. I don't know about you in Canada and England, but in Scotland, the public sector won't use Zoom. They seem to have something against Zoom. They only use Teams, which obviously nobody in the community can use, which maybe it's convenient or not, but it's a real difficulty. But the research we did showed that almost everybody used Zoom. There was some WhatsApp groups and things like that, some of which had their issues, but it was that face-to-face. And that while it's not the same as sitting in a room, for some people it's a really comfortable space. And as we got used to it, people found that they were having meaningful connections online. They were being able to talk openly and honestly, and they were getting the sort of release and support that they needed at a really, really difficult time. And go back to think something that Allison said is, you know, just for people to be able to connect in and say, God, it's been a difficult week, and, you know, I'm really struggling with my coping strategies aren't working in this environment, and to be able to share that with people. So what I would say is that actually, I think the thing for me about peer support is which is rather beautiful about it, is that I think there is some digital innovation, but it's all about the relationship. And that means that it doesn't sit comfortably with a lot of the people who work in e-health, who think it's about the technology. And to me, peer support shows that the technology is there to serve. You're not there to serve the technology. And there is a lot of learning, and hopefully some of the stuff that we have collected from people, because the best learning comes from people talking about what works for them, can help people in other places. So I would emphasize that I think in terms of digital, as we come out of COVID, there needs to be far more focus on how the digital space can be used to connect people rather than to put people through online courses or online sets of treatment. And I think it is possible to do it. It is not for everyone, but it is also a preference for others. So I would like to see online peer support, but also online appointments to become a matter of course and a choice for you, and for us to see that we can have meaningful connections and we can have meaningful peer support in this space.
I can see vigorous head nodding almost. I think there might be universal approval there. Allison, vigorous head nodding from yourself.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think I did see it work during the pandemic. You know, I saw, and again, it was in settings where the funders who were originally funding in-person programming allowed for that flexibility to say, you know, do what you need to do to be able to spend the money how you need to spend it to be able to provide these services, right? And it was when sort of funders took their hands off a bit and allowed for us to use it to the best of our abilities that we were able to do some really innovative things with technology. But it's funny what Louise was saying. I remember talking to some of I was working with a specific app and I was speaking with our app developers and they were trying to sell me on, oh, you know, there's this new innovative code where if they say this, it'll generate an auto response to them to say this. And I was like, absolutely not, take that away. We don't want that, right? Because, and then it was just so funny, like the disconnect between, oh, this really cool technology is going to be awesome. But no, that's not what we're looking for in the peer support space. We're looking for human to human connection. But I'm less familiar, obviously, with the context overseas, but I'm also very aware of some of the gaps in technology and the fact that it's not accessible to everybody. And so, you know, even folks that might want to connect those ways might not be able to. And so I think as we elevate technology and utilize it to make sure that we can build those human to human connections, we have to make sure it's accessible to everybody that wants to access it, not only a privileged few. So, yeah.
With a question in the chat there just about, and I'm very interested in this myself, and just I think there's a couple of different lenses to view stigma through. So there might be stigma of mental illness as a whole, which I'm sure all of us are very aware of, stigma of the role of peer supporter. And so, yeah, so I think you can see that question in the chat too, but I'll kind of say it out loud. Would be, do you think that the pandemic has helped reduce mental health stigma and the understanding around mental health challenges? And if so, how is this impacting on the peer supporter role? Amanda, would you mind contributing first?
I actually worry about the narrative that's out there. You know, we tend to get told, oh, we've all really struggled during lockdown, and so go and get some help. You need to go to your GP. There's a real pathologizing of mental health going on, and I think that only increases stigma. I don't think it decreases stigma, and I think I am worried about that because it's, you know, it's taking several steps backwards in my view. So so to kind of bring that down to a kind of negative, but I think when you know, every time I hear all of that, I get quite concerned about how that is playing out. I think that if I bring it back into my trust, some of the stigmas continue, and some teams are, you know, culturally less than we would want them to be. But where I think that our peer support workers have maybe come into their own is in their understanding of how to keep themselves well and well-being, and that is actually being recognized by other members of staff in their teams who are talking to them about, well, how do you manage this kind of, I'm struggling, how are you managing that? And they're often quite surprised. They kind of send me a lovely excited email going, oh, man, nurse asked me how I keep myself well. It was really exciting. And those kinds of things that we're breaking down, I think, have been broken down. But in terms of wider, that kind of meta narrative around, you must have been struggling, the pandemic's been awful, lockdown's been awful, you need to go and get help for your mental health, is less than helpful.
I'm going to weave your answer, because it's a great answer, Amanda, into one of the questions I've gotten privately, which is, I think funding is always a question that we get stuck on and we get a bit scared of and we don't want to talk about. But I think governments are talking about mental health, like you said, and they are investing in different types of way to lesser and greater amounts. And so the question is, like, what are our thoughts or our experiences on if that investment is going to come anywhere near peer support? And maybe we don't know the answer to that, but are there things that you've done, you're doing, or you can think of that can steer that kind of in the peer supporter direction, if we are all in agreement that it's a great intervention for the mental health impacts of the pandemic? Anyone want to hit that, Allison or Louise? Go for it, Louise.
I mean, as I say, in Scotland, we're in quite a different position where there is a lot of the investment in mental health comes through what we call health and social care partnerships. And they've probably been much more willing and much more interested in services that include peer support workers, peer support approaches than, say, the traditional health services. We are noticing some changes. I agree with Amanda about the narrative. I do worry about the pathologising of what's just normal challenges to our mental health as day-to-day, is it has to be specialist, you have to go to a doctor. Maybe being an old cynic, well, when the old cynic of me comes out, or the old lefty, is I think this is a bit of a not a too subtle fight back from the professional bodies. So while we have an overwhelmed NHS, the only solution is more doctors, more nurses. It's not something different. So I do think we have to be aware of the fact that people will find different ways to challenge new things. However, to give you an example from Scotland, I was at a meeting, a Scottish Government stakeholders meeting, mental health recently, and our newish general psychiatrist, who's a sort of lead psychiatrist for the Scottish Government, was speaking about new wellbeing hubs that all primary care GP practices will be able to tap into. And the representative there from the union started saying, this is a nonsense, you're just taking nurses from one part of an overstretched system to another. And he said, we will not be taking nurses. These teams will not have lots of registered professional body workers. These teams will have support workers, employment workers, they'll have peer workers, and they'll have link workers. And I've never heard anything like that in Scotland before. I think there was a collective jaw drop from the third sector people on the Microsoft Teams screen, which obviously you can't see. But I think there is some recognition in some parts of our system that things need to change. The new initiatives, the things they're commissioning, tend to have more. So we're very fond of the idea of link workers, and it's becoming peer workers. So I do think that there is possibly some money coming. What it does seem to be is crumbs from the table at the moment. And I think we need in Scotland to start thinking about the solutions to the supposed crisis, or whatever the crisis is in mental health, is not about bunging more to existing services, but looking at what we do, particularly in the community nearer people, and that peer support's a big part of that. I think we've got a part to play in that, but it's very interesting that we're starting to see it. The money isn't necessarily going there yet at a national level, but it could be. So, you know, even in countries like this where there's been a real resistance, not in every area, but quite a resistance to investing seriously in peer support at a national level, and we're starting to hear people say, you know, we need different setups, we need different workforce. So I'm quite hopeful about that.
to get better at coming off mute. I've got my next question that I'm going to weave in. So sorry, Allison and Amanda, I'm not going to give you an opportunity to answer that one specifically. It's even more controversial, the next one, which you'll be very, very happy about. So I've got a question privately here, but I think it's a great one. It's not specifically to the England, Amanda, but it makes me think about the fact that the NHSs in England have done just amazing work over the last 2 years to recruit peer support workers. I can't remember the exact number, Amanda. Is it approaching something like 4,000 peer support workers? It's really, it's just unbelievable in such a short amount of time. And so for some areas in the world, peer support is growing. Any of you on the call from the US, it's almost a bit old hat. You've had peer support workers in specialist positions for a really very long time. But I think with new waves like this comes the monetization of any system. So there's lots of small business out there. I think I could be accused of it potentially myself around the evaluation and the support and that body that kind of comes with it. So does any of the panelists kind of have any thoughts on that? And, happy for you to kind of share your opinion. And if that is beneficiary, is it contextual? Is it something we've really got to keep an eye out for? And maybe Amanda, to make it a bit safer potentially, is what does 4,000 new staff coming on actually mean? And when Allison talked about those support services, like actually specifically, what do you think it's going to be for those 4,000 new staff?
Yeah, so I mean, we've been promised, I guess, in the transformation 10,000 over the next kind of 5 years. So we'll see. What it means is people like me coming a little bit late to those conversations and going, you can't just recruit all these peer support workers without putting some structures in place. Have you actually thought how they're going to get trained, how they're going to get supervised, where your experienced peer support workers are, and create those posts? Because there's 2 of us peer support leads in NSFT. We're a very large organization, and there's only 2 of us. So, we can't provide all the supervision, guys. They haven't actually thought about those structures. And if we're not careful, of course, we're setting peer support up to fail. And what history will say is, well, peer support failed, but actually that's not true. They've actually failed peer support because they failed to understand the contextual structures that need to go in. So I think that we probably will be looking towards external partners and agencies to do it, because we can't do it all. We simply can't. And if there's somebody who can, I try and evaluate my peer support workers, and it takes up an awful lot of time, and I don't have time, and I try and get my R&D department in, and they kind of get a bit excited at the beginning, and then suddenly, oh, well, Amanda, you can do it. No, I haven't got time. If there's a way that we can kind of outsource that, then I think that we probably will end up doing, because, unless we are able to evidence that we're making a difference, of course, the funding doesn't happen. But I think really for me, I'm scared to put my email on at the moment, because I get another, oh, look, I've got to recruit, and they've got to be in post by the end of this financial year, which is the end of March. So many peer support workers, or you're going to lose the funding. And I'm going, yeah, but I can't, you haven't actually thought where they're going to sit. You haven't thought how the team structure is going to look like. You haven't contained them at all. And I then get raised eyebrows saying, well, are you arguing you don't want more peer support workers? I'm going, no, I'm not. But actually what I'm saying is, you can't just, put people in. It's actually not fair. And it's not okay. So this is being driven at pace. For reasons, I guess that, it is a way of, they are looking at, well, look, we can advertise a nurse or an OT, and we will put that out, and we don't get any applicants, right? And we will advertise it over and over again, and we don't get any applicants. So actually, we can't keep looking to that. And while that's my other, question is, well, yes, but peer support workers don't do the same thing. So, you can't just say, well, we can't get nurses, so therefore we're going to shore up and have this flood of peer support workers. But,
thank you for that, Amanda. I think I saw you nodding, Allison, when you're saying that, when Amanda was making that point, that we're probably going to need help from the outside. But I think maybe getting back to the kind of the juicy bit of that question is, there's probably room for monetization is maybe, I don't want to say that there's exploitation there, but maybe my question to you is like, what is a good support? Like when you were agreeing, what was in your mind of what is that going to be, that support on the outside that's required?
Yeah, I think again, I think it depends. And Canada is so big and so different, right? Like what you need in terms of support in an urban area is going to look very different than what you need in terms of support somewhere else. And I think so. I think that, you know, I also struggle with this, like, oh, if I, you know, I've seen one federal posting that mentioned peer support, and I was so excited, and then also terrified of you know, where is that money actually going to go? What does that program look like? Is it going to be well supported, or is it going to be something where we invest a bunch of money and the peer support workers get burnt out and overworked and it all crumbles, right? So I do think that Peer Support Canada has a role to play in that. I think that, you know, I think that being an advocate of good quality peer support programs, which involve adequate supervision and training and resources and support. I think Peer Support Canada needs to play an advocacy role in that piece with the government, making sure that they understand that if they're going to support this, then they have to support X, Y, and Z as well, or you have to look for these elements in order to know where to put your money and get your bang for your buck. I also think that Peer Support Canada has a role in supporting the peer support workforce. So I think that you know, things like accessible community of practice meetings, accessible supervision, accessible mentorship, accessible training. You know, do I think that the entire burden of that falls on Peer Support Canada? No, I don't. I think it's a shared responsibility between the peer support worker themselves, the employer, Peer Support Canada, you know, probably another 3 separate things that I'm not thinking of right now, right? So I think that we need to understand that sharing of the responsibility of supporting the workforce. Otherwise, I mean, you know, in Canada, our nurses right now are overworked, underpaid, and not wanting to do the job anymore, right? So we're gonna run into the same exact thing if we don't adequately support the peer support workforce, right? So I think, yeah, I think like ask peer support workers, right? Like part of what we're doing right now is in the strategic planning process is talking to peer support workers in order to understand where they're struggling, what their challenges are, you know, and how they picture us, a national organization, potentially helping with that, you know, and I think some of it is community of practice meetings and things like that, but you know, parts of it are so location specific that there's parts of it that doesn't make sense for a national organization to necessarily take on. But yeah, we're in the crux of figuring this out, and so I'll keep you posted.
I think we probably have to keep sharing, right? Like
Yeah.
we need peer support for each other, that's for sure. So we're really close to the end. Geez, I like connecting, and I just feel like this conversation has been, it's overdue. It's so overdue. So I've got one last question, and just a reminder for anyone who joined late, once I've answered this question, Lisa in Habitus is going to open up breakout rooms that you can optionally join, and you can jump between them. Amanda, Louise, and I and Allison will all have a breakout room with our name on it that you'll be able to join after we answer this question. And if you don't have time, you need to drop off. For some of you in Western North America, this is the beginning of your day, so we understand. For those of you in the UK or Europe, this is the end of our day, so we will be, we've got all the time in the world. I can trap you here until midnight. Anyway, last question would be, so I've done some work in Western Canada. Any of you on the call in Alberta will understand natural disasters. It's a province that's very good at, well, unfortunately has gotten very good at supporting people through natural disasters. Out of that has come research that basically says that at the 2-year point after the initial part of a natural disaster is when mental health for the community as a whole is at its lowest. It's not the best science that's out there to kind of compare to the pandemic, but I feel like it's a good indicator for us. So that would mean that March could potentially be where we're starting to see the dip. Everything like your hopefulness, Louise, is potentially the pandemic will be with us for a long time, or we might be closer to the end. We don't quite know. But with that research out there, yeah, my question would be thoughts, plans, calls to action, potentially, maybe not that far, but anything you might be doing in 2022 to kind of support that peer support moving forward. And if you don't mind, Louise, going first.
I think there is something about the groups, whether they are like what I would call formal groups, that we're noticing quite a lot of groups in the community where people connect, maybe in cafes, they do a bit of an exercise class, they go for walks. And I think things like that are important because they're that first step for people, but they don't feel too serious. I think sometimes things like that are really underrated because they're not seen as important as medical interventions. I think what we forget about is that actually the medical interventions don't work unless people have that other stuff as well. So I don't really, I struggle with that linear approach. But I think that, I think you're right. I think that in the immediate period, we found people like had a spirit of trying to cope. I think people are feeling jaded now. I think the workforce is feeling tired and jaded. I think people like me are coming round to the idea that life has changed, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's how you sort of manage to make that happen. And I know I'm a very social person, but I found, getting back out into real life, I'm not worried about it, but I just found it a bit more tiring than I remember it being 2 years ago. So I think there's also the thing is that I think there's people who've maybe been living with quite serious mental health problems during the last 2 years who have become more isolated. And I think we have to find ways to help people to move beyond just the medical interventions, but also to get back with people and to find what brings them that joy in life and what brings them meaning in life. So I think there is a lot of things, but my call to action would be a far more investment in non-medicalised community-based activity that people can connect in through their choice, but not to over-professionalise it and not to audit it and clinical governance it out of a reality, but for I think some of the public sector to have more trust in the relational and peer approaches.
Louise, Amanda, would you mind going next?
I think Louise said it beautifully. I think that what you highlight is that trust between the public sector and third sector, and I think that traditionally that's been really challenging, dare I say it, and maybe we've kind of had this attitude that, well, no, we know we're the experts, right? We can risk assess this to the nth degree. And oh, hello, I thought my cat would show an appearance at some point. There we go, say hello. But I think in terms of peer support, generally, I think that there's a real opportunity. As I said earlier, that worry and concern that I have around the pathologizing of the difficulties that we've all been experiencing over the last couple of years. Peer support have got some really good solutions, good ways of thinking about that, good ways of helping the country heal from that. And I guess my concern is that they won't be heard.
It's such a good point. Allison, you get our closing thoughts before we jump to the breakout. Just before I do let you speak, I know that there's a couple more questions that were shared with me that I didn't get to. What I would say is if, because they're really, really great questions, if you'd like to choose someone to ask that question to in a breakout, that would be my recommendation. Go for it, Allison.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I also think that it's about finding this balance between defining the role of a peer supporter so that it doesn't get, so we don't fill the gap with a peer, right? That's not the solution. So I think there's a balance we need to find in terms of defining and to a certain extent standardizing the role of a peer supporter without taking away that authenticity, the adaptability, the humanness and the social connection that is peer support. So I think that that's kind of going to be our battle for the next little while. And also I think, it's supporting the workforce. Again, I know I sound like a bit of a broken record, but But, you know, if the expectation is that, and I agree that peer support workers do have a role to play in supporting people's well-being post-pandemic or pandemic version 7, whatever we're on right now. I think if they have a role to play, then we need to make sure that they're equipped to be able to do that. It's not fair or ethical to sort of say, yeah, these peers can do it and you know, burn out a whole other workforce. So those are sort of two of my things right now. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. So what will happen next, as I say, Lisa's just about to open those breakout rooms. Amanda, Louise, Allison, please make sure to go to the breakout room with your name on it, or it might be a bit strange. I'm going to say as well, I will call you all back in about 10 to 12 minutes. And then we'll just say a final thank you and cheerio to everyone. You've got the ability to jump between breakout rooms if you'd like to do that. So don't worry if you want to speak to more than one person. So with that, I will get you, Lisa, to open up those breakout rooms.